The iron shackles bit into Zerina Claveth's wrists as she knelt in the scorching Texas dust, watching her master count gold coins with the same hands that had just torn her family apart. The year was 1852, and on the sprawling Thornhill Estate outside San Antonio, a young enslaved woman was about to unleash something that would transform her from property into legend. Within weeks, the most powerful ranch owner in 3 counties would begin screaming about shadows that hunted him, clawing at skin that felt like it was burning from the inside, descending into a madness so complete that doctors would flee rather than witness what consumed him. This is the story of how an 18-year-old woman with nothing but forbidden knowledge and righteous fury brought a tyrant to his knees, exposed the rot festering beneath Texas wealth, and became known throughout the South as the Voodoo Queen, who proved that some debts can only be paid in suffering. But the truth behind the curse was far darker than anyone imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction block in San Antonio's Central Plaza stood beneath a merciless June sun, its wooden surface stained dark from years of human commerce. Zerina Claveth stood with 17 other enslaved souls, her bare feet burning against heated planks, while prosperous ranchers circled like vultures evaluating carrion. The air hung thick with the smell of livestock, unwashed bodies, and the particular stench of desperation that clung to places where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Behind the auction platform, the limestone buildings of San Antonio gleamed white as bone, their Spanish colonial architecture a monument to centuries of conquest and exploitation. Maxwell Hart owned the largest cattle operation in South Texas, his Thornhill Estate sprawling across 40,000 acres of prime grazing land worked by 200 enslaved people. His wealth came not just from cattle, but from contracts supplying beef to military forts, trading posts, and the wagon trains heading west toward California goldfields. He stood now in his finest suit, silver buttons catching sunlight, his weathered face betraying nothing as the auctioneer presented each person for inspection and sale. Zerina had been born on a Louisiana sugar plantation, raised by a grandmother who carried knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd survived the Middle Passage. Her grandmother, known only as Maman Brigitte to those who sought her wisdom, had taught Zerina about herbs that healed and herbs that harmed, about spirits that walked between worlds, and about the old ways that slaveholders feared more than rebellion. When yellow fever swept through Louisiana in 1851, claiming Zerina's entire family, she'd been sold to pay estate debts, passing through 3 different owners in 8 months before landing on this auction block in Texas. The auctioneer's voice cut through the humid air like a blade. "This one's got spirit, gentlemen. Young, strong, can work house or field. No visible scars, all teeth intact. Spoke some French, which might suit you educated types. What's your opening bid?" Maxwell Hart raised his hand with casual authority, offering a price that silenced other bidders immediately. Money wasn't a concern for the richest man in 3 counties. He needed workers for his expanding operation, and this woman's intelligence showed in her eyes despite her circumstances. Smart slaves made efficient workers as long as they understood their place. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Papers signed, money exchanged, ownership transferred with the same legal formality used for purchasing horses or furniture. Zerina watched Maxwell Hart's face as he counted out gold coins, noting the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes, the way his mouth settled into lines of habitual cruelty, the expensive rings on fingers that had never known honest labor. From the diary of Andrew Harris, Maxwell Hart's ranch foreman, dated June 15, 1852, "Boss bought another one today. Pretty thing with defiant eyes. Hope she learns faster than the last girl who thought she could sass back. The whipping post hasn't been used in 3 days. Might need it soon enough." The wagon ride to Thornhill Estate took 4 hours through countryside that shifted from settlement to wilderness with startling abruptness. San Antonio represented civilization's fragile foothold in territory that had been Comanche hunting grounds for centuries. Spanish missions dotted the landscape like abandoned sentinels, their crumbling walls testament to earlier colonial ambitions. Live oak trees twisted into grotesque shapes by constant wind provided sparse shade, while mesquite and prickly pear stretched toward horizons that seemed to mock any human attempt at conquest. Maxwell Hart rode ahead on a black stallion, never once looking back at the wagon carrying his newest acquisition. His foreman, Andrew Harris, drove the wagon, occasionally glancing at Zerina with an expression that mixed curiosity with contempt. The other enslaved workers who'd come to town for supplies sat silent, their faces carefully blank in the way of people who'd learned that showing emotion invited punishment. As they approached Thornhill Estate, the scale of Maxwell Hart's empire became apparent. Fenced pastures stretched for miles, containing thousands of cattle bearing his brand. Smaller buildings dotted the landscape, housing workers, storing equipment, and processing the endless stream of beef that funded Hart's lifestyle. The main house rose from the Texas plains like a plantation mansion transplanted from the deep south, its white columns and wraparound porches. An architectural assertion that Southern culture could take root anywhere money and violence could clear the ground. The slave quarters consisted of 20 rough-built cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house, each structure housing between 6 and 10 people in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Zerina was assigned to Cabin 7, sharing space with 5 other women who worked the house. They eyed her with the wariness of people who'd learned that newcomers could be informants or troublemakers who brought punishment down on everyone. That first night, lying on a straw mattress that did nothing to soften the hard ground beneath, Zerina listened to the sounds of the estate settling into darkness, cattle lowing in distant pastures, night birds calling, the creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes, and underneath it all, the muffled sounds of suffering that no amount of distance could completely mask. She touched the small leather pouch hidden beneath her dress, feeling the smooth stones and dried herbs her grandmother had given her years ago. Maman Brigitte's final words echoed in her memory. The old ways survive because oppressors fear what they cannot control. Remember who you are, even when they try to make you forget. The Thornhill Estate operated with brutal efficiency under Maxwell Hart's absolute rule. He'd built his empire through calculated cruelty, understanding that fear motivated more reliably than any other tool. His reputation extended throughout Texas as a man who tolerated no disobedience, no inefficiency, no questioning of his authority. Those who challenged him disappeared, their fates serving as warnings to others who might consider resistance. What drives a man to build an empire on the broken backs of people he refuses to see as human? How does wealth accumulated through suffering corrupt the soul of everyone it touches? Maxwell Hart would soon discover that some knowledge cannot be controlled, some spirits cannot be broken, and some debts demand payment in suffering equal to what was inflicted. This moment, this first night when Zerina Claveth touched the sacred objects her grandmother had given her and felt the stirring of power that slavery could not extinguish, would mark the beginning of Maxwell Hart's descent into a madness so complete that witnesses would speak of it in whispers for generations. But first, she would need to understand the full scope of the monster she'd been sold to, and discover allies among people who'd learned to hide their resistance behind masks of submission. Before we continue this haunting tale of how an enslaved woman brought a tyrant to his knees using knowledge older than America itself, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear reveals how even the most powerless can wield devastating force when pushed beyond endurance. But the darkest truths lay hidden in what happened when Zerina discovered she wasn't the first woman to try cursing Maxwell Hart, and learned what happened to those who failed. The Thornhill Estate kitchen stood separate from the main house, a deliberate architectural choice that kept cooking fires and enslaved workers at a safe distance from Maxwell Hart's refined living spaces. Stone walls absorbed heat during brutal Texas summers, while cast-iron stoves radiated enough warmth in winter to make the space barely tolerable. The air perpetually carried scents of roasting meat, baking bread, and the sharp tang of lye soap used to scrub everything to Maxwell Hart's exacting standards. Copper pots hung from ceiling hooks like instruments awaiting their players, while knives stayed sharp enough to split hairs because dull blades earned brutal punishment. Zerina's first morning began before dawn, roused by Grace Harris, the head cook who ruled the kitchen with efficiency, born from 30 years of surviving under Maxwell Hart's ownership. Grace stood barely 5 feet tall, her hair wrapped in bright cloth that violated estate rules but somehow escaped punishment, her hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She evaluated Zerina with eyes that had seen too many newcomers break under the estate's brutal routine. "You work for me now," Grace said without preamble, her voice carrying the musical accent of South Carolina. "Master Hart likes his breakfast at precisely 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. Food better be perfect, served at exact temperature, presented like he's dining with the governor. You mess up, we all pay, so don't mess up." The kitchen staff consisted of 6 women who moved with practiced coordination, each knowing their role in the complex choreography of feeding Maxwell Hart, his wife Kalen Vireth, and whatever guests the estate hosted. They worked in near silence, communicating through glances and subtle gestures, their faces carefully neutral in the way of people who'd learned that expressions could be dangerous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kalen Vireth Hart had been born to Virginia plantation aristocracy, raised to manage enslaved households and host social gatherings that cemented her husband's political influence. She appeared in the kitchen doorway that first morning, her silk morning dress rustling softly, her pale face powdered to perfection despite the early hour. At 35, she maintained the delicate beauty that Southern society prized, though close inspection revealed tight lines around her mouth and shadows beneath her eyes that no powder could hide. "The new purchase," Kalen said, studying Zerina the way one might evaluate a potentially valuable piece of furniture. "Can you read?" The question hung dangerous in the air. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Texas, punishable by whipping or worse, but Kalen's tone suggested she already knew the answer, that this was a test of honesty rather than a trap. "Yes, ma'am," Zerina replied, keeping her voice respectful while meeting Kalen's gaze directly. Something flickered in Kalen's eyes, quickly suppressed. "Good. You'll assist me in the library Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, organizing books and reading correspondence aloud when my eyes tire. Grace will train you in kitchen duties the remainder of your time. My husband values efficiency, and I expect you to demonstrate why you are worth the price he paid." After Kalen departed, Grace pulled Zerina aside, her voice dropping to a whisper barely audible above the kitchen's morning sounds. "Mrs. isn't like Master Hart. She got kindness in her, buried deep under years of being his wife. But don't mistake kindness for protection. She won't save you if he decides you need breaking." The main house revealed itself gradually as Zerina's duties expanded beyond the kitchen. 14 rooms filled with furniture shipped from New Orleans and Europe, walls lined with paintings depicting pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to Texas reality, libraries containing books in multiple languages, parlors designed to showcase wealth to visitors who came seeking Maxwell Hart's political influence or business partnerships. But luxury couldn't mask the underlying atmosphere of fear that permeated every corner of the estate. Servants moved through rooms like ghosts, silent and swift, making themselves invisible while performing endless tasks. The house felt simultaneously opulent and oppressive, its beauty built on a foundation of human suffering that no amount of expensive decoration could hide. Maxwell Hart presided over his empire from a study lined with maps showing his landholdings, account books documenting his wealth, and weapons mounted on walls like trophies. Zerina first entered that space 3 days after her arrival, carrying coffee on a silver tray while Grace watched from the doorway, ready to intervene if the new worker made any mistakes. Hart sat behind a massive oak desk, reviewing papers with the focused attention he brought to every aspect of his business. He didn't acknowledge Zerina's presence until she'd placed the tray exactly where he expected it, then looked up with eyes that held the warmth of a rattlesnake evaluating prey. "You're the Louisiana one," he said, not a question but a statement claiming ownership of her entire history. "Your previous owners said you were tractable, but I see defiance in your eyes. That will be corrected if necessary. I've broken stronger spirits than yours." From Maxwell Hart's personal journal dated June 18, 1852. The new acquisition shows promise despite concerning independence. Will monitor closely. Cannot afford disruption with the military contracts requiring increased beef production. Every worker must function at peak efficiency or be replaced. The estate operated on rigid schedules that divided each day into blocks of labor punctuated by brief moments for eating and sleeping. Enslaved workers rose before dawn and worked past sunset, their lives measured in tasks completed and punishments avoided. Maxwell Hart inspected operations daily, riding his black stallion through pastures, and checking on work crews with an overseer's calculating eye for inefficiency or disobedience. Andrew Harris, the ranch foreman, enforced Hart's will with systematic brutality. A bull-like man with hands scarred from years of violence, Harris took visible pleasure in his authority over people who couldn't fight back. He carried a braided leather whip that had tasted more blood than anyone cared to count, and he used it with the casual frequency of someone swatting flies. Zerina witnessed her first whipping on her 4th day at Thornhill Estate. A young man named Joseph Taylor had been caught taking extra rations for his sick sister, a crime that Maxwell Hart considered theft of his property. The punishment took place in the central yard, where all enslaved workers were forced to watch, a deliberate demonstration of what happened to those who broke the rules. The sound of leather cutting flesh, Joseph's screams that started strong but devolved into broken sobbing, the smell of blood mixing with Texas dust, the absolute silence of witnesses who'd learned that reacting brought their own punishment. Zerina stood rigid, her face carefully blank while inside her grandmother's voice whispered about debts and justice and power that existed beyond what oppressors could see or control. That night in Cabin 7, the women who shared Zerina's space finally spoke to her directly. Luna Stevens, who'd been at Thornhill Estate for 12 years, explained the unwritten rules that determined survival. Tessa McCarthy, separated from her own family 5 years earlier, shared which overseers were merely cruel versus which were genuinely sadistic. Ivy Newman, purchased as a young girl and now 23, described the fate of those who tried running away into wilderness that offered death by exposure, thirst, or Comanche raids. "Maxwell Hart is evil," Luna said quietly, her voice barely rising above the night sounds outside their cabin. "But he's not stupid evil. He knows exactly how much suffering keeps people productive versus how much breaks them completely. He's calculated cruelty, like other men calculate profit margins." What kind of society creates men like Maxwell Hart and tells them their brutality is justified? How does a woman like Colleen maintain her humanity while benefiting from her husband's crimes? As Zerina settled into the rhythms of Thornhill Estate, learning its routines and understanding its hierarchies of power, she began recognizing patterns that the enslaved community had documented for years. Maxwell Hart's empire ran on more than cattle and land. It depended on absolute control over every person within his domain, maintained through violence, fear, and the systematic destruction of anything resembling hope. But Zerina carried something Maxwell Hart couldn't see or control. Knowledge passed through generations of women who'd survived worse than Texas brutality, who'd learned that power came in forms that whips and chains couldn't touch. Soon she would discover she wasn't alone in that knowledge, and that Maxwell Hart had made enemies whose patience for justice had long since expired. The library at Thornhill Estate occupied the southeast corner of the main house, its tall windows catching morning light that illuminated leather-bound volumes Maxwell Hart collected like trophies but rarely read. The smell of old paper and furniture polish mixed with the ever-present dust that Texas wind carried through every crack and crevice. Colleen Vireth Hart spent her afternoons here, away from her husband's study and the social obligations that defined her public life, finding refuge among books that offered glimpses of worlds beyond the estate's boundaries. Zerina's Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the library became islands of relative peace in an ocean of brutal labor. Callie needed help organizing correspondence, reading aloud from books that strained her weakening eyesight, and managing the social calendar that governed their household's interactions with Texas elite. The work required literacy, discretion, and intelligence that Colleen recognized despite the system that classified Zerina as property rather than person. "Read me the letter from Colonel Brody Nash," Colleen instructed during their second week working together, the one regarding the September cattle delivery to Fort Stockton. Zerina opened the correspondence with careful hands, noting Colleen's trust in allowing an enslaved woman to handle documents containing business details. The letter discussed quantities, prices, and delivery schedules for beef contracts that formed the foundation of Maxwell Hart's wealth. As she read aloud, Zerina noticed Colleen's expression shift from passive listening to active attention. "Read that section again," Colleen said, leaning forward. "The part about adjusted pricing for military contracts." The numbers revealed discrepancies between what Fort Stockton paid and what Maxwell Hart reported in his accounts. Small differences that added up to significant sums being diverted somewhere other than legitimate business expenses. Colen's face remained neutral, but her fingers drummed against the armrest of her chair, a tell that Zerina learned indicated troubled thoughts. Their relationship developed through small moments of shared understanding, careful conversations that danced around the massive injustice separating them. Colen never acknowledged the moral horror of slavery directly, but she showed kindness in ways that suggested awareness of the system's brutality. Extra food sent to the cabins, medical supplies provided when someone fell ill, punishment reduced when Maxwell Hart's attention was elsewhere. "My father owned 300 people in Virginia," Colen said one afternoon, her voice distant as she gazed through the library windows toward the cattle-dotted plains. "I grew up believing this was natural order, that some people were meant to serve while others were meant to rule. But 35 years of living inside that belief has shown me things that make sleep difficult." Zerina chose her words carefully, aware that honesty could be dangerous, even in moments of apparent openness. "What kinds of things, ma'am?" "The mathematics of human suffering," Colen replied softly. "How many backs must break to polish these floors? How many families torn apart to purchase that painting? How many screams echo through the night so I can wear silk dresses and host dinner parties?" She turned to face Zerina directly. "You think me complicit in my husband's crimes. You're correct. But complicity and approval are not identical, and powerlessness wears many faces." The library conversations revealed Colen's growing awareness that her husband's business practices extended beyond legitimate cattle operations. Money disappeared into ventures she wasn't supposed to notice. Political alliances formed with men whose reputations carried whispers of corruption. And Maxwell Hart's increasing paranoia about potential threats to his empire. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters and work areas beyond the main house, Zerina built different relationships with people who understood resistance in ways Colen never could. Grace, the head cook, possessed encyclopedic knowledge about the estate's operations, gathered from 30 years of watching, listening, and remembering everything powerful people said in front of servants they considered too insignificant to matter. "Master Hart thinks we're furniture that occasionally needs oiling," Grace explained during a rare private moment in the kitchen. "He talks business, plots schemes, admits crimes, all while we stand right there serving food or cleaning. We know things that would destroy him if the right people heard them." Luna Stevens worked as a seamstress, spending hours in Colen's dressing room repairing expensive clothes while overhearing conversations between the mistress and her visiting friends from other estates. She'd learned about family connections between powerful ranchers, about shared investments in ventures that skirted legality, about collective efforts to suppress any challenges to their dominance over Texas territory. Tessa McCarthy worked the stables, caring for horses worth more than human lives, and she'd noticed visitors who arrived after dark, meetings held away from the main house, conversations conducted in whispers that suggested activities Maxwell Hart preferred to keep hidden. She'd seen men with military uniforms who departed with sealed packages, observed payments that didn't match official contract amounts. The enslaved community at Thornhill Estate had developed sophisticated systems for sharing information, protecting each other, and maintaining hope despite circumstances designed to destroy both. They communicated through songs whose lyrics carried coded meanings, through patterns in how laundry was hung to dry, through the timing of movements that allowed brief exchanges of critical information. Zerina discovered these networks gradually, earning trust through her demonstrated discretion and her obvious intelligence. They recognized in her something beyond typical survival skills, a quality that reminded them of stories about women who'd led rebellions or escaped to freedom or wielded power that terrified slaveholders. "Your grandmother was Maman Brigitte," Grace said one evening, not a question but a statement of knowledge that made Zerina's breath catch. "We heard stories even in Texas. Women who knew the old ways, who could call spirits and mix remedies that healed or harmed depending on need. You carry that knowledge." The small leather pouch Zerina kept hidden contained items her grandmother had prepared for protection and power. Smooth stones from Louisiana rivers, where spirits dwelled, dried herbs whose properties bridged healing and harm, small bones that carried connections to ancestors who'd survived the Middle Passage. Maman Brigitte had taught her that these weren't superstitions, but concentrated knowledge passed through generations of women who'd learned to wield whatever power the universe offered, those with wisdom to see and courage to act. "There's others here who know things," Grace continued quietly. "Eli Barrett works the cattle but learned at plant medicine from his mother. Hayden Burke tends the horses and knows remedies for injuries that doctors can't fix. We survive by remembering what they try to make us forget." As summer deepened into oppressive heat that made breathing difficult and turned the ground hard as stone, Zerina began noticing patterns in Maxwell Hart's behavior that suggested vulnerability beneath his facade of absolute control. He suffered recurring headaches that left him irritable and prone to explosive violence. His sleep was troubled, evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes, and his habit of pacing the house at night. Most telling, he showed increasing paranoia about threats to his empire, suspecting conspiracies and betrayals where none existed. From the private observation shared among enslaved workers, Master Hart wakes, screaming some nights, yelling about shadows hunting him, drinks laudanum heavy to sleep, which makes him meaner come morning, something eating at him from inside, something no doctor can cure. The household staff had learned to read Maxwell Hart's moods like weather patterns, adjusting their behavior to avoid storms of violence. Bad days meant staying invisible, speaking only when addressed, moving with exaggerated care to avoid any action that might trigger his rage. Good days, rare and unpredictable, offered slightly reduced tension and marginally less danger. But Zerina noticed something others had missed. Maxwell Hart's worst episodes coincided with certain times of month, with particular weather patterns, with visits from specific business associates. The headaches followed a rhythm that suggested external causes rather than random affliction. His paranoia spiked after meeting with men whose names she'd heard whispered as being connected to illegal activities. "He's afraid of something," Zerina told Grace during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "Not afraid of us, not afraid of normal threats. Afraid of consequences catching up with crimes he thinks he's hidden." "Guilty men see enemies everywhere," Grace replied. "And Maxwell Hart's guilt could fill the Rio Grande twice over. What happens when those with absolute power begin suspecting their control is slipping? How do people who've built empires on violence respond when they sense that violence might soon target them?" As July temperatures turned Thornhill Estate into something resembling hell on earth, Zerina began formulating understanding of Maxwell Hart's vulnerabilities that would soon transform into something far more dangerous than he could imagine. But first, she would need to learn exactly what crimes haunted the man who thought himself untouchable, and discover whether the spirits her grandmother had taught her about were willing to exact justice that human law refused to provide. The August heat pressed down on Thornhill Estate like a physical weight, turning the air thick enough to taste and making every breath feel like drowning. Cattle sought shade beneath sparse mesquite trees, while workers moved through their tasks with the slow deliberation of people conserving energy against an enemy that couldn't be fought. The main house shutters stayed closed against the sun, creating dim interiors where shadows gathered in corners and secrets festered like infected wounds waiting to rupture. Zerina had been at the estate for 9 weeks when she discovered the first concrete evidence that Maxwell Hart's empire was built on more than cattle and enslaved labor. It happened during a Thursday afternoon in the library, where Colleen had asked her to organize correspondence files that had accumulated over the past 5 years. The work required sorting hundreds of letters by date and sender, creating an archive that Colleen claimed would help manage the household's social obligations. But the letters revealed patterns that had nothing to do with dinner parties or charitable functions. Correspondence with men holding military ranks discussed shipments that used cattle deliveries as cover for moving other goods. References to packages that required special handling, to payments made through intermediaries, to routes that avoided official inspection points. The language stayed deliberately vague, but the implications became clear when cross-referenced with dates and amounts that appeared in other documents. Maxwell Hart was using his legitimate cattle business to smuggle weapons, ammunition, and supplies to groups operating outside legal channels. Some went to settlers pushing into Comanche territory who needed arms for protection and conquest. Others traveled to private militias forming throughout Texas as tensions grew over statehood, slavery, and territorial expansion. The profits from these illegal operations dwarfed what his legitimate business generated, and the web of corruption extended through military officers, government officials, and business partners across multiple territories. From a letter between Maxwell Hart and Colonel Brody Nash, dated March 1852, the usual delivery will include special packages as discussed. Ensure your inspection officers are properly motivated to overlook cargo discrepancies. The frontier requires flexibility in how we interpret regulations, and our mutual prosperity depends on maintaining current arrangements. Zerina memorized names, dates, and details while filing the correspondence exactly as Cullen had instructed. Her grandmother's training had included developing memory techniques that allowed precise recall of information without need for written notes. Each letter she read became permanently recorded in her mind, building a comprehensive picture of Maxwell Hart's criminal enterprise. Cullen noticed Zerina's careful attention to the documents. "You're reading every word, not just sorting by date." The statement hung between them, neither quite accusation nor approval. Zerina met Cullen's gaze steadily. "You asked me to organize these files, ma'am." "Proper organization requires understanding what I'm organizing." Something flickered across Cullen's face, an expression too complex to categorize as simple emotion. "My husband conducts business that benefits from discretion. What you learn in this library stays in this library, understood?" "Yes, ma'am." But both women knew that knowledge, once acquired, couldn't be controlled through simple commands. Colleen had deliberately given Zerina access to information that revealed her husband's crimes, and neither of them needed to articulate why. Some truths demanded witnesses, even if those witnesses were people the law refused to recognize as fully human. The library revelations connected with observations Zerina had been gathering from other sources throughout the estate. Tessa McCarthy had noticed military wagons arriving after dark, loading cargo from storage buildings that supposedly contained only cattle feed and ranch equipment. Eli Barrett, who worked the outer pastures, had seen riders departing toward Mexico with pack horses carrying loads that didn't match their stated purposes. Hayden Burke had overheard conversations in the stables about routes that avoided official roads and checkpoints. The enslaved community's collective intelligence network had documented Maxwell Hart's illegal operations for years, but their knowledge carried no legal weight in a system that classified them as property rather than witnesses. They'd watched crimes unfold with the helpless frustration of people who understood injustice but possessed no power to challenge it through official channels. Grace shared crucial information during a late evening in the kitchen after the main house had retired for the night. Maxwell Hart's been doing this since he first established Thornhill Estate 15 years ago. Started small, moving guns to settlers, expanded into ammunition, supplies, even information about military movements and Comanche positions. He's got connections reaching all the way to Washington, politicians and officers who profit from keeping the frontier chaotic, because chaos justifies military spending and territorial expansion. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond one corrupt rancher. Maxwell Hart was part of a network that deliberately maintained frontier violence to justify appropriating indigenous land, to create markets for weapons and supplies, to enrich politically connected individuals who saw Texas as an opportunity for empire building regardless of the human cost. "There's more," Grace continued, her voice dropping to barely audible. 3 years ago, a federal investigator named Cameron Steele came asking questions about irregular military contracts. He stayed at the estate for 2 days, reviewing records and interviewing workers. Maxwell Hart was nervous the whole time, drinking heavy and pacing all night. "What happened to the investigator?" Zerina asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Found dead 20 miles from here. Horse spooked and threw him, according to the official report. But Joseph Taylor was working the stables when they brought the body back. Said the man had injuries that didn't match falling from a horse. Said he saw Andrew Harris cleaning blood off his clothes that same morning." Murder added to the list of Maxwell Hart's crimes, and it explained the increasing paranoia Zerina had observed. Guilty men lived in constant fear that their crimes would be discovered, that witnesses would speak, that justice would eventually catch up with them, despite their wealth and connections. But the most disturbing discovery came from an unexpected source. Cullen herself, during a moment of unguarded honesty in the library, revealed the truth about her husband's psychological deterioration. Maxwell has been troubled for months. He claims to see shadows moving in corners of his vision, hears whispers when no one is speaking, wakes screaming about hands reaching for him from darkness. The doctor attributes it to stress and prescribes laudanum, but the medicine only makes the episodes worse. Zerina recognized the symptoms immediately. Someone had already begun working against Maxwell Hart, using methods her grandmother would have understood. The shadows he saw, the whispers he heard, the nightmares that destroyed his sleep were not random afflictions. but the early manifestations of a curse someone had initiated months before Zerina arrived at Thornhill Estate. "Has your husband made enemies recently?" Zerina asked carefully. "Someone who might wish him harm?" Colin's laugh carried no humor. "My husband makes enemies like other men make acquaintances." But one situation particularly troubled him. Last winter, a woman named Ivy Newman had a young one, fathered by Maxwell during one of his visits to the quarters. The baby died within weeks, and Ivy blamed my husband for separating her from the infant, for denying her the ability to nurse and care for her own blood. She cursed him publicly before Andrew Harris whipped her unconscious. Ivy Newman lived in cabin 7, sharing space with Zerina and the other houseworkers. She was 23 years old, quiet to the point of invisibility, her eyes holding depths of grief that went beyond what words could express. Zerina had noticed the terrible scars on Ivy's back, had observed how she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been broken and imperfectly healed. That night, after the other women in the cabin had fallen into exhausted sleep, Zerina approached Ivy where she sat staring out the window at stars that offered no comfort or answers. "You started something," Zerina whispered. "Against Maxwell Hart. I can feel it working." Ivy turned slowly, her face unreadable in the darkness. "My grandmother taught me before they sold her south. Said some debts can only be paid through suffering equal to what was inflicted. I mixed my baby's burial clothes with graveyard dirt, spoke words passed down through generations, called on spirits that remember every crime committed on this land. The curse is incomplete," Zerina said with certainty. "It's affecting him, making him paranoid and troubled, but it hasn't achieved full manifestation. Something is missing or being blocked." "I don't have the full knowledge," Ivy admitted. "My grandmother was sold before she could teach me everything. I know how to start the working, but not how to complete it. Maxwell Hart suffers, but not enough. He needs to feel the same helplessness, the same agony, the same slow destruction that killed my baby." The two women sat in darkness, sharing knowledge that their oppressors had tried for centuries to destroy. Between them existed understanding that transcended the artificial division slavery imposed, recognition that power came in forms that whips and chains couldn't touch, that justice sometimes required methods the law refused to recognize. "I can help," Zerina said quietly. "My grandmother was Maman Brigitte. She taught me the complete workings. How to call spirits properly, how to focus intention into manifestation, how to ensure that curses achieve their full purpose." From that moment, two women who'd both lost everything to Maxwell Hart's cruelty began collaborating on something that would transform his vague psychological troubles into concrete, devastating madness. They would complete what Ivy had started, using knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd learned that sometimes the only justice available was the justice they created themselves. What happens when oppressed people discover they possess power their oppressors cannot see or control? How do individuals denied legal recourse by an unjust system pursue justice through alternative means? As August gave way to September, and the unbearable heat finally began to ease, Maxwell Hart was about to discover that his crimes had consequences that wealth and violence couldn't prevent, and that the women he'd classified as property were about to demonstrate exactly how much power the supposedly powerless could wield when desperation, knowledge, and righteous fury combined into focused intention. The September moon hung full and heavy over Thornhill Estate, painting the Texas plains in silver light that transformed familiar landscapes into something otherworldly. Zerina and Ivy met in the space behind the slave quarters where mesquite trees provided cover from casual observation, and the constant wind carried away whispered conversations. The air smelled of sage and dry earth, of cattle and horses, of the particular scent that came before rain even though no clouds marked the star-filled sky. Around them, the estate slept its troubled sleep, unaware that two women were preparing to unleash something that would shatter Maxwell Hart's carefully constructed empire. Ivy had brought items she'd been collecting since her baby died 8 months earlier. Graveyard dirt from the small cemetery where enslaved workers were buried in unmarked graves. Fabric from the burial clothes that had wrapped her infant's tiny body. Hair she'd saved from Maxwell Hart's hairbrush during her time working in the main house before the whipping that had nearly killed her. A lock of her baby's hair, preserved despite the pain that touching it caused. Each item carried connections that could be focused into manifestation, potential energy, waiting for someone with knowledge to activate it properly. Zerina had prepared her own materials, items her grandmother had given her combined with things she'd gathered during her months at the estate. Roots from plants that grew in shadow, herbs gathered during specific moon phases, small bones from animals that had died natural deaths. The leather pouch she'd carried from Louisiana now contained ingredients for workings her grandmother had taught her, remedies that existed in the space between healing and harming, that could cure or curse depending on intention and need. The working Ivy started was foundation, Zerina explained quietly. She called attention from spirits that watched this land, established connection between Maxwell Hart's crimes, and the justice they demand. But completing the curse requires understanding exactly what we're trying to achieve. Madness has many forms, and we need to choose the one that fits his specific guilt. They discussed Maxwell Hart's crimes in detail, cataloging the full scope of his cruelty, the families he'd torn apart through sales and separations, the women he'd violated, treating their bodies as property to be used according to his pleasure, the men he'd worked to death in his fields and among his cattle herds, the investigator he'd murdered to protect his illegal smuggling operations, the systematic brutality he'd employed to maintain absolute control over everyone within his domain. He needs to feel everything he's inflicted on others, Ivy said, her voice carrying intensity that went beyond mere anger into something purer and more focused. Not just pain, but the specific helplessness of knowing suffering is coming and being unable to prevent it. The isolation of realizing no one will help you. The despair of understanding that your torment serves someone else's purposes. From the private journal Zerina kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in Cabin 7, we are not seeking revenge, but balance. Maxwell Hart has created suffering without consequence for 15 years. The universe demands equilibrium, and we are simply instruments through which that balance will be restored. His madness must mirror the madness of a system that treats people as property and calls it civilization. The complete working required materials that would be difficult to obtain. Maxwell Hart's blood, which would create the most direct connection to his physical body. Soil from places where his worst crimes had occurred, which would anchor the curse to specific guilt rather than vague malevolence. Personal items he valued, which could be corrupted to turn his own attachments against him. Most challenging, they needed access to spaces where he felt most secure, to plant materials that would work their effects gradually and irreversibly. Grace provided crucial assistance, her 30 years at Thornhill Estate, having taught her every secret pathway and hidden corner. She knew when Maxwell Hart followed predictable routines, when the main house stood empty except for minimal staff, when opportunities existed for actions that would go unnoticed until far too late to prevent their consequences. Master Hart bleeds himself medically once a month, claims it helps his headaches, Grace explained during a carefully orchestrated conversation in the kitchen. Dr. Jason Curtis performs the procedure, and there's always blood-soaked rags that get burned in the kitchen fires. Except, not all of them burn immediately, and what happens to materials before they reach the fire isn't closely monitored. Luna Stevens worked in Callan's dressing room, which adjoined Maxwell Hart's bedroom through a connecting door that stayed unlocked. She had access to his personal items, his clothing, his brushes and toiletries, his private spaces where he believed himself safe from observation. "I can get what you need," Luna said simply. "And I can place things where they need to be without anyone noticing. Been invisible in that room for 12 years, no reason they'd start seeing me now." Tessa McCarthy controlled access to the stables, where Maxwell Hart kept his prized black stallion and where the small cemetery for estate animals provided cover for gathering materials that would seem innocuous if discovered. There are spots near the horse graves where certain plants grow, fed by what gets buried there. My grandmother taught me which ones carry properties useful for workings. I can gather what's needed, and no one will question why the stable girl is collecting weeds. The enslaved community at Thornhill Estate had transformed from isolated individuals into a coordinated network focused on a single purpose. Each person contributed knowledge, access, or skills that alone meant nothing but together created capability that Maxwell Hart's surveillance couldn't detect or prevent. They were demonstrating truth that terrified slaveholders, that people classified as property retained humanity, intelligence, and agency that no amount of violence could completely destroy. But Zerina understood that physical materials alone wouldn't be sufficient. The curse required spiritual component, connection to forces that existed beyond what could be measured or controlled through conventional means. Her grandmother had taught her that effective workings required belief not in supernatural intervention but in focused human intention amplified through ritual and symbolism. The spirits weren't external entities but manifestations of collective will, concentrations of purpose that could affect reality when properly directed. "We need witnesses," Zerina told the assembled group during a midnight gathering in the small clearing behind the quarters. "Not people who will testify in courts, but people who will hold the intention with us, who will focus their justified anger into the working and give it power that individual effort couldn't achieve." Over the following week, 17 people joined the working, men and women who'd suffered under Maxwell Hart's cruelty, who'd lost family members to his violence, who'd endured violations and brutality that left scars on bodies and souls. Each person brought their specific grief and anger, their particular memories of injustice, their focused desire for balance that the legal system refused to provide. They met in darkness, speaking in whispers, sharing stories that documented the full scope of Maxwell Hart's crimes. Each testimony added weight to the working, strengthening the connection between his guilt and the consequences they were preparing to manifest. The curse was becoming something larger than individual revenge, transforming into collective judgment that carried the authority of accumulated suffering. "Maxwell Hart believes himself untouchable," Zerina said during one of these gatherings. "He thinks wealth and violence make him immune to consequences. But he's about to learn that some debts transcend what law and money can manipulate. He's about to discover that the people he's classified as property are about to reclaim power he thought he'd stolen forever." The working took shape gradually, each component added with careful attention to timing and intention. Blood obtained through Grace's access to medical waste. Personal items provided by Luna's invisibility in private spaces. Soil gathered from locations where specific crimes had occurred. Herbs and roots prepared according to traditional knowledge. All of it combined with focused intention from 17 people who'd transformed their suffering into purpose that demanded manifestation. From the collective documentation hidden throughout the slave quarters, "We are not acting from hatred but from justice. We are not seeking destruction but balance. We are instruments through which the universe corrects what human law refuses to address." Maxwell Hart's madness will be precise, specific, and proportional to the suffering he's caused. Let no one claim this is random affliction. This is deliberate consequence delivered by those he thought powerless. As preparations reached completion, Zerina felt the weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't simple folk magic or superstitious ritual. This was focused human intention, directed through symbolic action, collective will manifested through coordinated effort, justice pursued through means that existed outside systems designed to protect people like Maxwell Hart from accountability. What happens when the oppressed stop accepting their oppression as inevitable? How do people denied legal recourse create their own systems of justice and accountability? Maxwell Hart was about to experience answers to these questions in ways that would destroy his sanity, his empire, and his fundamental understanding of how power operated. But first, the curse needed to be planted in spaces where it could work its effects gradually, irreversibly, and with the terrible precision that his own calculated cruelty had demonstrated for 15 years. The spirits weren't supernatural entities floating in darkness. They were the accumulated weight of suffering demanding acknowledgement, the focused intention of wounded people claiming agency, the collective will of those who'd been told they had no power proving exactly how wrong their oppressors had been. And Maxwell Hart, who thought himself master of everything he surveyed, was about to discover he'd never controlled the most important thing: the justified fury of people who'd finally decided that enough was enough. The October wind carried the scent of approaching winter across Thornhill Estate, that peculiar smell of changing seasons mixed with cattle, dust, and the smoke from cooking fires that burned constantly in the slave quarters. Zerina stood at the edge of the small cemetery where enslaved workers were buried without markers or ceremony, her hands working soil between her fingers while the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of blood and fire. Around her, invisible to casual observation, 17 people maintained their daily routines while secretly coordinating actions that would soon transform Maxwell Hart's vague psychological troubles into devastating, irreversible madness. But Zerina understood that completing the curse required more than spiritual workings and collected materials. Maxwell Hart's empire extended beyond Thornhill Estate, protected by networks of corrupt officials, business partners, and political allies who benefited from maintaining the systems that enabled his crimes. Destroying him completely meant exposing those networks, documenting his illegal operations in ways that would survive his personal destruction, and ensuring that justice reached beyond one man to address the broader conspiracy he represented. She needed an ally with power, someone whose moral authority could challenge the entrenched corruption that protected men like Maxwell Hart. Someone who existed outside the local networks of mutual protection, who possessed both the capability and motivation to act on evidence that enslaved witnesses could provide. Her thoughts turned to a name she'd heard whispered in the slave quarters, spoken with the careful hope of people who'd learned not to trust easily, but couldn't quite extinguish belief in the possibility of justice. Federal Marshal Grant Porter had been investigating irregularities in military supply contracts throughout Texas for 8 months, following leads that suggested systematic fraud involving ranchers, Army officers, and government officials. His reputation preceded him. A former Union officer who'd resigned his commission rather than participate in the forced removal of indigenous peoples, a man whose commitment to actual law, rather than the corrupted version practiced in frontier territories, had made him enemies among the very people he was supposed to work with. Race knew how to contact him through networks that enslaved people had developed for passing information across vast distances. Songs carried messages through their lyrics and timing. Quilts hung in specific patterns communicated warnings or opportunities. Travelers moving between estates and settlements carried verbal messages encoded in seemingly innocent conversations. The underground communication system that helped people escape to freedom could also be used to reach authorities who might actually listen to testimony from witnesses the law refused to recognize. There's a man named Eli Barrett who drives supply wagons between San Antonio and the outlying settlements, Grace explained to Zerina during a pre-dawn conversation in the kitchen. He's free, got his papers 20 years ago, and established himself as reliable transportation. More importantly, he's trustworthy and connected to people who know how to reach Marshal Porter without alerting the local authorities who'd warn Maxwell Hart immediately. The message Zerina composed had to be carefully crafted. Too explicit, and it might be intercepted and understood by people who destroy both the message and the messenger. Too vague, and Marshal Porter might dismiss it as unreliable information from questionable sources. She needed to provide enough detail to demonstrate credibility while protecting the safety of everyone involved in gathering the evidence. From the message Eli Barrett carried to Federal Marshal Grant Porter, a concerned party wishes to inform you that substantial evidence exists regarding illegal weapons trafficking, fraudulent military contracts, and murder committed to conceal these crimes. The primary actor operates a large cattle ranch outside San Antonio and maintains protection through corrupt local officials. Documentary evidence and multiple witness testimonies are available to federal authorities willing to investigate outside local jurisdiction. Contact can be established through Eli Barrett, who carries this message and can facilitate secure communication. 3 weeks passed before response arrived, 3 weeks during which Zerina and her collaborators continued preparing the curse while simultaneously documenting Maxwell Hart's crimes in forms that would constitute legal evidence. Luna had been copying correspondence from the library, carefully reproducing letters that detailed illegal transactions while leaving the originals untouched. Tessa had been recording observations about nighttime cargo movements, documenting dates, times, and descriptions of what was being transported. Grace had been maintaining detailed accounts of overheard conversations, preserving exact quotes that revealed criminal intent. Marshal Porter's response came through Eli Barrett during a routine supply delivery. The message was brief but promising. Evidence will be reviewed. Protection can be arranged for witnesses willing to provide testimony. Coordination must occur outside local jurisdiction to prevent interference from corrupted officials. Further communication will establish specific arrangements. The knowledge that federal authority was preparing to investigate gave new urgency to completing the curse. Maxwell Hart needed to be psychologically destroyed before legal consequences arrived, needed to be reduced to such obvious madness that his testimony would be dismissed as unreliable, needed to be so clearly broken that his powerful allies would abandon him, rather than risk association with someone who'd become a liability rather than an asset. Zerina worked with Ivy to finalize the curse's components, combining traditional knowledge with careful observation of Maxwell Hart's specific vulnerabilities. His paranoia about threats to his empire would be amplified until he saw conspiracies everywhere, trusted no one, suspected even his closest allies of plotting against him. His nightmares about shadows and whispers would intensify until he couldn't distinguish waking from sleeping, reality from hallucination. His body would develop tremors, sweating, and the physical manifestations of terror that no doctor could attribute to conventional illness. The curse works through his own guilt, Zerina explained to the gathered witnesses, who would focus their attention into the working. We're not imposing external suffering, but amplifying internal consequences he's been suppressing for years. Every person he's harmed, every crime he's committed, every moment of cruelty he's inflicted will return to him with compound interest. His mind will turn against itself, making him experience the helplessness and terror he's caused others to feel. The materials were prepared according to precise requirements. Maxwell Hart's blood, obtained through Grace's access to medical waste, was mixed with graveyard dirt from locations where his victims were buried. Personal items provided by Luna, hair from his brush, and threads from his clothing, were woven together with roots and herbs that carried properties relevant to the intended effects. Soil from places where specific crimes occurred was combined with water from the well he drank from daily, creating physical connection between his body and his guilt. Most crucial was the poppet, a small figure constructed from materials connected to Maxwell Hart and dressed in fabric taken from his own clothing. Traditional knowledge held that such figures created sympathetic links between symbolic representation and physical person, allowing actions performed on the representation to manifest in the actual target. Zerina didn't know whether this operated through supernatural mechanism or psychological effect channeled through focused belief, but generations of practitioners had documented its effectiveness when properly constructed and employed. We'll plant the primary working in 3 locations, Zerina told her collaborators. First, beneath the floorboards of his bedroom where he sleeps and is most vulnerable. Second, in the soil of the potted plants in his study, where he conducts business and feels most powerful. Third, buried at the crossroads on the estate's main entrance, where he passes daily. Each location will anchor different aspects of the curse, ensuring it affects every dimension of his life. Luna would plant the bedroom component during her regular duties in Colen's adjoining dressing room. Grace would handle the study placement while serving Maxwell Hart's breakfast. Tessa would bury the crossroads element during her early morning stable work when no one else was yet awake. Each action would appear completely innocent if observed, just servants performing their regular tasks, but together they would create a network of influence that would surround Maxwell Hart with the curse's effects everywhere he went. The night before they implemented the plan, the 17 witnesses gathered in the clearing behind the slave quarters for the ritual that would activate and focus the curse's power. They formed a circle under the October moon, each person holding their specific grief and anger, their justified desire for consequences that the legal system refused to provide. Zerina stood at the center holding the poppet, speaking words her grandmother had taught her, words passed down through generations of women who'd learned that power came in forms their oppressors couldn't see or control. The language mixed African phrases with English, traditional invocations with improvised additions specific to their situation. What mattered wasn't the exact words but the focused intention they represented, the collective will of people who'd transformed suffering into purpose. Maxwell Hart, who has taken everything from those who had nothing to give, who has built wealth on broken bodies and shattered families, who has murdered to protect his crimes, and laughed at the suffering he caused. Zerina's voice carried across the circle. We call upon the spirits of all those harmed. We invoke the weight of accumulated injustice. We focus the power of collective witness to manifest consequences you've escaped for too long. Your mind will turn against itself. Your body will betray you. Your empire will crumble as those you've harmed reclaim power you thought you'd stolen forever. Each witness added their voice, speaking names of people Maxwell Hart had destroyed, recounting specific crimes he'd committed, focusing their intention into the working with intensity that made the air feel charged with electricity despite the clear sky. They weren't begging supernatural entities for intervention. They were declaring their own agency, manifesting their collective will, transforming from victims into agents of justice that existed outside systems designed to deny them any power. What happens when people classified as powerless discover they possess capabilities their oppressors never imagined? How does collective action amplify individual intention into force that can reshape reality? As the ritual concluded, and the witnesses dispersed to their cabins before dawn revealed their gathering, Zerina felt certainty that they'd created something that would achieve its purpose. Maxwell Hart's madness wasn't random affliction waiting to happen. It was deliberate consequence, carefully constructed and precisely focused, about to be unleashed by people he'd thought too broken to fight back. The next morning, Luna planted the bedroom component while Colin was occupied elsewhere. Grace added materials to the study's potted plants while serving breakfast. Tessa buried the crossroads element in pre-dawn darkness. The curse was now physically anchored in Maxwell Hart's daily environment, waiting to manifest through mechanisms that combined psychological vulnerability with focused collective intention. And in San Antonio, Federal Marshal Grant Porter reviewed evidence that documented crimes reaching beyond one corrupt rancher to expose networks of fraud and violence that extended throughout Texas territory. Justice was approaching from two directions simultaneously: spiritual consequences manifested through traditional knowledge, and legal accountability enabled by witnesses who'd been denied recognition as fully human, but whose testimony would soon prove impossible to dismiss or ignore. The November morning dawned cold and clear over Thornhill Estate, frost coating the mesquite trees like delicate lace and turning the ground hard as iron beneath boots that crunched with each step. Inside the main house, Maxwell Hart woke screaming for the third consecutive night, his voice raw from hours of terror that laudanum could no longer suppress. Colleen stood in the doorway of their bedroom, her face carefully neutral, while inside she felt something between pity and satisfaction, watching her husband claw at blankets that offered no protection from whatever hunted him in darkness, both real and imagined. The curse had been working for 3 weeks, its effects escalating with mathematical precision, from vague unease to absolute psychological destruction. Maxwell Hart's paranoia had evolved from reasonable caution into delusional certainty that everyone around him was plotting his destruction. His nightmares had intensified from occasional troubled sleep into nightly horror shows that left him exhausted, terrified, and increasingly unable to distinguish dreams from waking reality. His body had developed tremors that made eating difficult, sweating that soaked through clothing within minutes, and a gauntness that suggested something was consuming him from inside. Dr. Jason Curtis had been summoned 4 times in 3 weeks, each visit producing increasingly desperate attempts to explain symptoms that matched no conventional illness. The physician prescribed stronger doses of laudanum, recommended complete rest, suggested that Maxwell Hart's condition might improve if he reduced his business activities and avoided stress. But the medications made things worse rather than better. The rest brought no relief, and stress seemed to find him regardless of what activities he avoided. "Your husband is suffering from nervous exhaustion combined with some form of brain fever," Dr. Curtis told Colleen during his most recent visit. "I've seen similar cases in men who've experienced severe trauma or maintained unsustainable levels of anxiety. The mind simply rebels against continued pressure and creates symptoms that force the body to stop functioning normally." But Cowan had been observing details that the doctor either missed or chose to ignore. Maxwell Hart's episodes intensified when he entered specific rooms, particularly his bedroom and study. His paranoia focused on particular individuals, especially the enslaved workers he'd treated with particular cruelty. His nightmares contained specific images: shadows with accusing eyes, hands reaching from darkness, voices speaking names of people he'd harmed. This wasn't random nervous exhaustion. This was guilt manifesting with such force that it was literally destroying his sanity. From Cowan's private journal, discovered years later, "I watch my husband disintegrate and feel no desire to save him. Perhaps this makes me as monstrous as he is, but 35 years of complicity in his crimes has exhausted whatever mercy I might have once possessed. If he's being destroyed by the very people he enslaved, then perhaps justice exists after all, even if it comes through means I cannot fully understand." The enslaved community watched Maxwell Hart's decline with carefully hidden satisfaction. They saw him stumbling through the estate, jumping at sounds only he could hear, speaking to people who weren't there, deteriorating into something that barely resembled the confident tyrant who'd ruled them with absolute cruelty. Zerina and Ivy observed with particular attention, noting how the curse's effects manifested exactly as intended, confirming that focused intention, combined with symbolic action, could indeed produce measurable results in physical reality. He tried, but Maxwell Hart's psychological destruction was only half of what needed to happen. His criminal empire still functioned, his corrupt allies still protected his interests, and his wealth still bought silence from anyone who might consider exposing his crimes. Complete justice required that his madness be accompanied by legal consequences that would dismantle everything he'd built and ensure his collaborators faced accountability alongside him. Federal Marshal Grant Porter arrived at Thornhill Estate on November 15th, accompanied by 4 armed deputies and carrying documentation that authorized federal investigation into allegations of weapons trafficking, contract fraud, and murder. His timing was deliberate, coordinated through messages passed via Eli Barrett, to arrive when Maxwell Hart's psychological state would make effective resistance impossible, and when the evidence gathering had reached completion. The marshal's appearance sent immediate shock through the estate's power structure. Andrew Harris, the brutal foreman who'd enforced Maxwell Hart's will through violence, recognized that federal authority superseded local protection and began calculating how to save himself rather than his employer. The household staff, who'd been documenting crimes for weeks, understood that the moment of testimony had arrived, that their carefully preserved evidence would finally receive official attention, that justice long denied might actually materialize. Maxwell Hart met Marshal Porter in his study, where potted plants concealed materials that continued amplifying his paranoia and guilt. The rancher's appearance shocked the federal investigator. Gaunt face marked by sleepless nights, trembling hands that spilled coffee across expensive carpet, eyes that darted constantly, as if tracking threats invisible to anyone else. This was not the confident empire builder described in preliminary reports, but something broken and desperate. "I've received serious allegations regarding your business practices," Marshal Porter began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to confronting powerful criminals. "Specifically, accusations that you've been using cattle deliveries as cover for illegal weapons trafficking, that you've defrauded the military through falsified contracts, and that you murdered a federal investigator named Cameron Steele to prevent exposure of these crimes." Maxwell Hart's response combined denial with paranoia. "Lies told by people trying to destroy me. Everyone is conspiring against me, you see. They whisper in the walls, they send shadows to hunt me at night, they've poisoned my food and my water and my very thoughts. You're part of it too, aren't you? Sent to finish what they started." The marshal exchanged glances with his deputies, recognizing that Maxwell Hart's mental state made direct interrogation unlikely to produce useful information. But the investigation didn't depend on the accused man's testimony. It depended on documentary evidence and witness statements from people who'd been observing his crimes for years. "I'll need to review your business records," Marshal Porter stated. "All correspondence, account books, shipping manifests, and contracts. I'll also be interviewing members of your household and work crews, and I expect full cooperation without any attempts to intimidate or harm potential witnesses." Grace stepped forward from where she'd been standing silently in the study's corner, her presence so habitual that neither Maxwell Hart nor the marshal had initially noticed her. "I can show you where the records are kept, sir. All of them, including the ones Master Hart thought were hidden where no one would find them." The next 6 hours transformed Thornhill Estate into a federal investigation site. Marshal Porter and his deputies reviewed 5 years of correspondence that Luna had been secretly copying, documents that revealed the full scope of the weapons trafficking operation. They examined account books showing payments that didn't match legitimate business expenses. They studied shipping manifests that contained discrepancies between reported and actual cargo. The paper trail was comprehensive, damning, and impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or clerical error. But the most powerful testimony came from the enslaved witnesses who'd been documenting Maxwell Hart's crimes while being classified as property, rather than people whose words carried legal weight. 17 individuals provided detailed statements describing what they'd observed, overheard, and experienced. Their collective testimony painted a picture of systematic criminal activity, protected by local corruption, of violence employed to maintain silence, of murder committed to eliminate threats. Zerina testified about the library documents that revealed coordination between Maxwell Hart, military officers, and government officials. Grace described conversations she'd overheard while serving meals, discussions of illegal transactions conducted in front of servants who powerful people assumed were too insignificant to matter. Tessa detailed the nighttime cargo movements she'd witnessed from the stables. Joseph Taylor, who still bore scars from the whipping he'd received for taking food, described what he'd seen when Cameron Steele's body was brought back to the estate. "These people are lying," Maxwell Hart insisted, his voice rising toward hysteria. "They're not even people, they're property, their testimony shouldn't be allowed. This is all part of the conspiracy, don't you see? The shadows sent them, the voices told them what to say, they're trying to destroy me because I know too much about what's really happening." Marshall Porter listened to Maxwell Hart's deteriorating rants with the professional detachment of someone who'd investigated enough criminals to recognize genuine madness when confronted with it. "Your mental state will be evaluated by medical professionals. But the evidence against you doesn't depend on your testimony or your sanity. The documents speak for themselves, and the witness statements corroborate each other in ways that demonstrate reliability regardless of the witness's legal status." Andrew Harris attempted to flee on horseback but was apprehended by deputies before he'd traveled 5 miles. Several of Maxwell Hart's business partners in San Antonio were arrested simultaneously in coordinated raids that prevented them from destroying evidence or warning each other. The network of corruption that had protected the weapons trafficking operation for 15 years collapsed within hours once federal authority applied pressure that local officials couldn't deflect or ignore. As sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Maxwell Hart sat in his study surrounded by the ruins of his empire, his mind fractured beyond any possibility of recovery, his body trembling with terror that no medication could suppress. The curse had achieved its purpose with devastating precision, transforming a confident tyrant into something broken and pitiful. But more importantly, the legal consequences had materialized alongside the spiritual ones, ensuring that justice extended beyond individual suffering to systemic accountability. Colleen watched federal deputies inventory her husband's assets, seize documents as evidence, and prepare to transport Maxwell Hart to San Antonio for formal charges and medical evaluation. She felt no sadness, no desire to protest or defend the man she'd been married to for 15 years. Instead, she felt something like relief that the performance was finally ending, that the pretense of respectability was being stripped away to reveal the rot underneath. "What will happen to the estate?" she asked Marshall Porter quietly. "That will be determined by federal courts once the full extent of your husband's crimes is established. But I suspect much of his wealth will be seized as proceeds from illegal activities. As for the people he enslaved, their status will also need to be legally resolved, though I imagine freedom will be part of any final settlement." Zerina stood in the kitchen watching through windows as Maxwell Hart was loaded into a wagon for transport to San Antonio, his once powerful body reduced to something that could barely support its own weight, his mind so shattered that he could no longer speak coherently. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in witnessing his destruction, only grim acknowledgement that justice, when it finally arrived, carried weight that crushed everything it touched. What happens when systems of oppression finally face consequences they've avoided for generations? How does collective action transform individual powerlessness into force capable of toppling empires? As darkness fell over Thornhill Estate on November 15, 1852, 17 formerly enslaved people understood that they'd accomplished something extraordinary. They'd destroyed a tyrant using both traditional knowledge and legal testimony. They'd exposed corruption that extended far beyond one ranch, and they demonstrated that power ultimately belongs to those with courage to claim it, regardless of what laws or customs declare about their status as property or people. The winter sun broke through morning clouds over what had once been Thornhill Estate, casting long shadows across land that no longer bore Maxwell Hart's brand or reflected his tyrannical authority. 3 months had passed since federal marshals had transported the broken rancher to San Antonio, where he'd been confined to a facility for the criminally insane after doctors declared him mentally incompetent to stand trial. His madness had proven too complete, too devastating for any court to determine whether he understood the charges against him or could participate in his own defense. The curse had achieved its purpose with precision that exceeded even Zerina's expectations, reducing a confident empire builder to something that barely qualified as human consciousness. The legal proceedings that followed Maxwell Hart's collapse had exposed corruption extending far beyond one Texas ranch. Federal investigators discovered networks of fraud involving military officers from 3 different forts, government officials who'd accepted bribes to overlook irregularities, and business partners who'd profited from weapons trafficking that armed both settlers pushing into indigenous territory and private militias preparing for conflicts over statehood and slavery. 12 men faced federal charges, their trials scheduled to begin in spring once prosecutors finished assembling evidence that would ensure convictions. Andrew Harris had been the first to break under interrogation, trading testimony against his former employer for reduced charges. His confession provided details about Cameron Steele's murder, describing how Maxwell Hart had ordered the federal investigator killed, and how Harris had personally carried out the execution made to look like a riding accident. The foreman's betrayal had cascaded through the conspiracy, with other participants rushing to cooperate once they understood that federal authority wouldn't be deflected by local protection networks. But the most significant legal development concerned the status of the people Maxwell Hart had enslaved. Federal seizure of his assets under criminal forfeiture laws had effectively dissolved his ownership claims, creating legal ambiguity about whether the 200 people who'd worked his land remained property subject to sale, or individuals whose bondage had been terminated through their enslavers' criminal prosecution. Marshall Grant Porter had advocated vigorously for the latter interpretation, arguing that people who'd provided testimony crucial to exposing federal crimes deserved freedom as both moral imperative and practical necessity. The legal arguments continued in courts and legislative chambers, but practical reality had already shifted. Most of the people who'd been enslaved at Thornhill Estate had departed for other territories, some heading north toward free states, others moving to establish communities of free black people in Texas cities. Still others simply disappearing into the vast frontier, where documentation mattered less than survival skills and determination. The abandoned estate stood as monument to collapsed tyranny, its buildings slowly deteriorating without the forced labor that had maintained them. Zerina and Ivy had remained in San Antonio through the winter, providing detailed testimony for the ongoing investigations, and working with Marshall Porter to document the full scope of Maxwell Hart's criminal operations. Their days were spent in courthouse offices reviewing evidence, their evenings in modest boarding house rooms where they processed the strange reality of existing outside slavery's constant threat and control. Freedom felt simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, offering possibilities they'd been denied, while requiring navigation of a world that still viewed them with suspicion and hostility, despite their changed legal status. "I keep expecting someone to grab me, to drag me back, to tell me this was all temporary and I still belong to someone," Ivy admitted during one of their evening conversations. 15 years of bondage doesn't release its grip on your mind just because lawyers argue about property rights in federal jurisdiction. Zerina understood completely. Her own grandmother's lessons had included warnings about the psychological chains that persisted long after physical ones were removed, about how oppression damaged souls in ways that freedom alone couldn't immediately heal. We're learning to be ourselves without the constant weight of someone else's ownership. It's a skill that takes practice, like learning to walk after years of crawling. Grace had chosen to remain at the estate, claiming squatters' rights in the main house kitchen where she'd worked for 30 years. At 60 years old, she had no interest in starting over in unfamiliar territory, preferring instead to maintain the space she'd always occupied while waiting to see what courts decided about the property's future. She'd been joined by several others who'd spent decades at Thornhill Estate and felt more connection to the land than desire for distant possibilities. "This ground is soaked with our sweat, watered by our tears, marked by our blood," Grace had explained when Zerina visited before her final departure. "Whatever happens to the legal ownership, this land will always carry a memory of everyone who suffered here. That's a kind of possession that transcends what any deed or title can claim." Luna Stevens had traveled north toward free territory, carrying letters of reference from Marshall Porter that documented her literacy and organizational skills. Tessa McCarthy had joined a community of free black ranchers establishing their own operations in less settled regions of Texas. Joseph Taylor had simply disappeared one night, heading west toward California, where gold rush chaos created opportunities for people willing to work hard and ask few questions about each other's backgrounds. The 17 witnesses who'd focused their attention into the curse that destroyed Maxwell Hart had scattered like seeds across the frontier, each carrying knowledge about what they'd accomplished, and understanding that justice sometimes required methods existing outside legal systems designed to deny them any power. They would tell their stories to others, would teach their children and grandchildren about power that couldn't be controlled through violence or legislation, would preserve memory of how collective action had toppled an empire that had seemed invincible. Claveth Hart, now simply Claveth after legally dissolving her marriage to a man confined to an asylum, had returned to Virginia with whatever personal possessions she'd managed to protect from federal seizure. Her family had welcomed her back with carefully maintained fiction that her husband's madness and criminality bore no reflection on her character or judgment. She carried guilt that would never fully release its grip, awareness that her complicity in Maxwell Hart's crimes made her partially responsible for suffering she'd witnessed, but failed to prevent. Some nights she woke from dreams where enslaved faces stared at her with expressions of judgment that no amount of rationalization could deflect. From Claveth's final letter to Zerina, written in February 1853, "I cannot undo my participation in systems that treated human beings as property. I cannot restore what was stolen from you and others who suffered under my husband's tyranny. But I can acknowledge the truth without excuses or justifications. I was complicit. I benefited from your suffering. I chose comfort over conscience until events forced recognition I should have reached decades earlier. You showed more courage in 3 months than I demonstrated in 35 years. That speaks to your strength and my failure, and no legal absolution changes those fundamental facts." Maxwell Hart himself existed in twilight state between consciousness and complete mental dissolution. The asylum doctors reported that he spent hours staring at walls, speaking to people who weren't there, describing in horrifying detail the shadows that hunted him through corridors both real and imagined. Occasionally, he experienced moments of clarity where he seemed to recognize his surroundings and understand what had happened to him, but those moments inevitably collapsed back into madness that offered no escape or relief. The curse continued working long after the people who'd created it had moved on to other concerns, sustained by guilt that required no external maintenance. From Dr. Maxwell Hart's medical records, dated March 1853, patient demonstrates complete psychological collapse, maintains that he is being hunted by spirits of people he harmed, that his crimes are being repaid through suffering specifically calibrated to match what he inflicted on others. Whether this represents delusional psychosis or some form of actual spiritual affliction remains beyond medical determination. Treatment proves ineffective. Prognosis is permanent institutionalization until natural death provides release from his torment. Zerina and Ivy eventually traveled north to Ohio, where established free black communities offered relative safety and opportunities for building lives outside slavery's shadow. They brought with them knowledge passed down through generations, traditional healing practices, understanding of plants and their properties, spiritual frameworks that existed outside Christian doctrine that slaveholders had used to justify bondage. They would become healers, teachers, and preservers of cultural knowledge that oppressors had tried for centuries to destroy. But they also carried darker knowledge about power and its exercise, about justice pursued through means that existed outside legal systems, about the reality that sometimes consequences only arrived when oppressed people stopped waiting for authorities to act and instead manifested accountability through their own focused intention. This knowledge would be passed to future generations, preserved in stories and practices that reminded descendants that power ultimately belonged to those with courage to claim it. Years later, travelers through South Texas would report strange occurrences at the abandoned ruins of what had once been Thornhill Estate, sounds of voices singing in languages that combined African and English, shadows that moved with purpose despite no visible sources. The sensation of being watched by presences that felt neither hostile nor welcoming but simply aware and witnessing. Local people avoided the property, claiming it was haunted by spirits of those who'd suffered there, that the land itself remembered and would never release its hold on that memory. Federal courts eventually sold the property to pay legal judgments, but subsequent owners struggled to maintain operations on land that seemed to resist cultivation and development. Workers reported feeling uncomfortable, experiencing dreams about events they hadn't witnessed, sensing that they were trespassing on ground that belonged to people who'd watered it with sweat and blood. The estate changed hands multiple times over the following decades, each owner abandoning attempts to restore it to profitability, until eventually the buildings collapsed into ruins and the land returned to wild mesquite and prickly pear. Zerina lived until 1891, reaching 77 years old and dying surrounded by grandchildren, who carried her stories forward into a century that would see slavery's legal abolition, but also its transformation into new forms of oppression and control. On her deathbed, she spoke about Maxwell Hart and what had happened at Thornhill Estate, explaining to the youngest generation that justice sometimes required patience, strategy, and willingness to wield power through means that oppressors couldn't anticipate or control. "We were told we had no power, that we were property without agency or voice," she whispered to granddaughters who leaned close to catch her final words. "But we discovered that power comes in forms that chains cannot bind and laws cannot regulate. We found that collective intention focused through traditional knowledge could achieve what legal systems refuse to provide. Remember this lesson. Remember that your ancestors were never as powerless as their oppressors claimed. Remember that justice delayed is not justice denied if people refuse to stop pursuing it." The story of the Voodoo Queen of Louisiana, the enslaved woman who cursed her master with devastating madness, entered folklore throughout the South. Details changed with each retelling, some versions emphasizing supernatural intervention, while others focused on psychological mechanisms and collective action. But the core truth remained constant, that even people classified as powerless could topple empires when they recognized their own agency and wielded it with strategic precision. What transforms victims into agents of their own liberation? How does suffering, when channeled through focused intention, rather than dispersed through despair, become power that reshapes reality? The answer lived in Zerina's story and in thousands of similar stories that enslaved people carried forward through generations. Power never truly belonged to those who claimed it through violence and legislation. It belonged to those who understood that human dignity couldn't be destroyed by laws declaring some people property, that knowledge passed through generations couldn't be erased by prohibitions against literacy, that justice would eventually manifest when people stopped waiting for authorities to grant it and instead created it themselves through whatever means proved necessary and effective. Some say that even now, on cold winter nights when wind blows across South Texas plains, you can hear voices singing in the ruins of Thornhill Estate. Not songs of sorrow, but songs of triumph, celebrating the moment when 17 witnesses focused their collective will into manifestation that destroyed a tyrant and exposed corruption that extended far beyond one ranch's boundaries. The spirits aren't restless or seeking vengeance. They're simply ensuring that memory persists, that future generations understand what their ancestors accomplished, and that the lesson about power and its true sources never fades into comfortable forgetfulness that allows history to repeat its cruelest patterns. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.